Hello, everyone. I'm Amelia Bowerly. I'm a senior product designer in the recently formed tenant scale group. And today I'm going to do my best to walk you through some of the work that the team has been doing with regards to cells and organizations. And before I start, I want to highlight that I've only been on this team for a few months. So much of the work that I'm going to share today is the team's and is based on the great work that Mike, our PM Christina, and the great group of engineers have been doing for the past year as part of the organization and PODS groups. So first, why did I want to talk about cells? Why are they important? And why am I talking about them in a UX showcase? As we grow as a company, and to avoid GitLab running into storage and performance and scalability concerns, we need to ensure that we have sufficient database capacity available. Various teams have been working on measures to address database capacity over the past year. And one example that you might have heard of is the decomposition effort, which split the GitLab.com database into multiple databases. And cells are a horizontal scaling solution, and they're essentially the proposed next step in this process. So that's kind of why cells are important, but what are they? You may have heard the word pods mentioned previously, and cells are just the newer name for that concept within GitLab. And though not the case currently, in future, cells could underpin GitLab architecturally. Why would we want to make that change, and what are the benefits that cells would provide for us? Now, cells theoretically provide a more horizontally scalable and resilient underlying structure for us to build on as we move forward. Moreover, the hope is that once they're fully built out, they will enable us to provide a more consistent experience between self-managed and .com. And why are cells more resilient than our current structure? They're resilient in part because they're more isolated from each other. So if one fails, the rest won't necessarily do so. We can also make more cells as needed, and they can be tied to specific geographical regions. So there are many benefits to the approach. So what you see on the screen now is a diagram that the team made to show how a cluster of cells might interact. And there's a lot of information in this diagram that we don't need to focus on right now, but I wanted to share it just so you can all see what cells might look like in practice. So what you see in this diagram are two cells. There's one right here with GitLab.com, and then there's also a second cell here. And while they share some things down at the bottom of this diagram here, you can see that otherwise cell 1 and cell 2 are essentially separate. And the cell with GitLab.com on it, this one, is separate from the second cell in the diagram. And that's kind of the isolation piece that I was mentioning earlier. So if the cell with GitLab.com on it, this one, had a problem, that wouldn't necessarily impact whatever was hosted on cell 2. And that's what makes cells more resilient as an option moving forward. And from this diagram, you can also imagine the existence of many cells. And that's kind of what the horizontal scaling piece that I was mentioning. And that's why it's considered a more scalable solution as we move forward. So that's a cell and what it is and why we're pursuing it. I also mentioned an organization. So what's that and why is it needed in addition to cells? You might remember that Mike talked about organizations in a showcase earlier this year. And as a quick reminder, the idea is that organizations will effectively become the new top-level group in GitLab. And they'll eventually contain things like settings and billing, which will apply to all the groups and projects within the organization. And organizations are going to help us to build cells by bringing together all related top-level groups under one umbrella that we can then move into a cell. And they will also help us to move closer to feature parity between self-managed and .com as we move more and more of the settings out of the admin menu, which currently only self-managed admins can see, and into the organization. So this now is a diagram that the team also put together, showing how organizations and cells will fit together. So this outer box, the whole thing essentially, is the cell. And then you'll notice that the cell contains multiple organizations, 3 in total, and that each organization could theoretically contain multiple top-level groups that interact with each other in various ways. So one organization has a single top-level group in it. Another has 2 that share all of their data, and a third has 4 that interact with each other in various ways. But essentially, these organizations are discrete units of related content that can be shifted between cells as they and we grow. So everything I've shared so far probably sounds like an architectural concern. What are the design problems here? You might remember that Mike's earlier UX showcase outlined how organizations might work and look in the future. And you might thus be wondering why I'm reintroducing the idea of an organization here just a few months later. The short answer is that cells were introduced and prioritized, which introduced a whole different set of constraints and meant the team had to rethink the organization and what the MVC could be. And for the curious, there's more information about why that change was made in a linked issue in this slide. But what does that mean for design then? Cells will be mostly invisible to end users of the product, but organizations will likely be visible in the UI, and cells will impact the way that they function. So how should organizations look and what should they contain? How will people navigate between them if they belong to more than one? That's kind of one big set of problems for Mike and I to solve. And the second set of problems involves better understanding how the isolation that's built into cells and by extension organizations will impact the experience of using GitLab. How might isolation impact the experience of GitLab? The MR, issue, and to-do counts, these friends here, are useful examples of the possible impact of this change. So right now, those counts are global and represent aggregated counts across the projects and groups the user is a member of. In a world of cells and organizations, would this still be the case? Or would these counts only apply to the organization the user is in at present? And if those counts changed based on the organization people were in, how would that impact the way people use and experience GitLab? The same thing would be true for things like the project and group lists and the Your Work section of the product. Would those lists only contain the projects and groups within a specific organization, or all projects and groups the user is a member of? And these sorts of questions hopefully communicate how the introduction of cells and organizations may impact the product. So all of those things probably sound like a big change, and they might be. So if we're going to do this, we need to understand the likely impact of it on people using the product. And we've started a series of investigations to look into how this change might impact people, how many people it would impact, and how they would feel about this change. Will, our UX researcher, ran the first investigation in his pod architecture sentiment research. And in that study, he shared a high-level visual example of how GitLab might change in future and asked people to talk through how that change might impact them. And you can see the 3 key takeaways from his research in this slide. But the short summary is the findings were reassuring in that people were generally open to the idea of more increased isolation between organizations, and that actually aligned with how many of them were using the product anyway, which was, for me, surprising, but a good finding in terms of our ability to move forward. Mike also started a conversation with the data team so we could find out how many people will be impacted by this change. And there was some good news here too, in that a majority of users, 77.72%, would likely only be members of a single organization, so not even be switching between 2 organizations. So that confirms Will's research to some degree as well, in that people were already essentially working within an organizational model anyway in many cases. And there's more information about the data that was gathered on the issue linked in the slide if you're curious to see more of that too. So with regard to the design questions about how an organization would look, what it could contain, and how people could navigate between them, Mike and I have been working on designs for the organization MVC. And Mike also created a design prototype, which contains all the screens we've been creating. In this milestone, we're sharing that design prototype with users and running sort of part problem validation and part solution validation effort. So we can start getting more feedback both on the designs as we're envisioning them, but also on how this restructuring might impact people's workflows. And our hope is that this study and that seeing more functional prototype will give people a better understanding of how organizations will work and look in GitLab and help us better understand their likely impact. And in this way, we're trying to get more insight on the questions raised in Will's first study. And if we find that the feedback around the idea of isolation has a large negative impact for users, that will help us to evaluate workarounds or possible alternate solutions. So in this current research study that we're running right now, what are we trying to learn? We're hoping to get insights into 3 key questions. The first is, can people navigate between organizations when needed? Mike came up with a series of different options for navigating between organizations. And based on the feedback thus far, we're testing 2 of them out with people to see how they respond. And what you see on the screen now is one possible option for navigating between organizations from within a modal. But you can see the full set of options that Mike came up with in the issue linked in this slide. The second question we're hoping the research will help answer is, what do you think people think about the navigation content and structure of the organization thus far? And is what we're proposing useful or not? And is there something they're imagining an organization could contain that it doesn't? So in the screenshot, you can see both the suggested MVC navigation for the organization and a simple MVC design for the organization front page. Are the pages we're imagining an organization to initially contain, do they make sense to users? And with the front page design, we're assuming people are going to want to customize it, either based on role or organization. So with that in mind, what you're seeing right now is really simple. It's just a frequently used groups and projects list and a README, which people can populate with whatever information is most helpful for them. But is that going to work for people? And is our idea that people want to ultimately customize this front page accurate or not? These are the kinds of questions we're hoping to get more answers to in our research. And the final question we're hoping to get insight into is that Will's initial research suggested that people weren't totally sure how organizations would work and look within GitLab. And now that we have a bit more of an idea of what they might look like and how they might work, does that change how people feel about the idea of organizations in GitLab at all? Is it something that will work for them and their companies or not? So with all of that being said, what are our next steps for cells and organizations? So in terms of the design, we're hopefully going to get a better sense of whether or not we're heading in the right direction when our research is completed at the end of this milestone. And we'll continue to update, change, and refine ideas after that round of feedback. And in this slide, you also see a feedback issue where you can see our design prototype and leave comments on it. So you can feel free to check it out. But the team's bigger goal is to get a proof of concept organization ready by the end of Q2 with a GA release of the MVC for organizations scheduled for the beginning of the next financial year. So the plan is to have cells in at least an MVC organization working in the product in about a year's time. That's a summary of where we're at so far with cells and organizations. And thanks for listening. And if there are any questions, I can try to answer them from my admittedly limited perspective in the team, but I can do my best to answer. And I'll try to stop sharing and check out the doc, see if there's questions.
Yeah, nice job. That one, even when I read the presentation before this, I was trying to wrap my head around organizations. And to me, it sounds like an organization is a company that you work for. So why would I belong to multiple organizations, and why do I need to see that as a like a for real UI element where I can switch between them, just like I can switch between groups or projects. So that's where I was kind of trying to see. I can't wrap my head around that, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, in talking to users, I think people are trying to figure that out too. And some people are talking about them like they're going to be another group, which I think we want to be careful about. They're, I think, probably trying to figure out how they're different than groups. But I think the idea is that people will mostly just have one, but there will be some companies that are really large and maybe they like acquire a second company or something like that, or they have different like business units within the company that have different billing accounts or something like that. Or maybe one part of their company is like an open source, all of their open source components. So they have an organization for all of their open source, and it will have different billing and permissions. And then there'll be sort of their proprietary part of their product, and the permissions and the team members who can access it are different. So that might be why some companies need separate organizations, multiple organizations. But yeah, I think primarily most people will only have one. They won't, I don't think we're planning to prohibit them from having more than one, but I think we're going to need to try to encourage them to stick with a smaller amount, just so it doesn't proliferate like groups or something like that. I don't know if that helps. Or
I would imagine that our dev persona would be a part of multiple organizations potentially, especially from like an open source perspective. If they're working on different open source projects, those could all be separate organizations that they're working within.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we are finding that, yeah, people who have kind of their personal accounts and then their kind of work accounts, like right now they're separating those out as separate accounts, or even within their browsers, like different browser profiles and things like that. So we're just kind of moving that within the product. But that is like one of the things that we're finding that I didn't necessarily expect, and that the research is kind of helping us to see a little bit more that, yeah, even though this feels like a really big change, a lot of people are already using the product in that way anyway.
Yeah, just to add on to some of the things that Amelia already brought up, like one of the things that we heard in the research or earlier research that she spoke about was like consulting companies that, deal with multiple entities that are using different aspects of GitLab. And so each organization, they would need to have access to or need to touch. And those, organizations would need to remain separate from each other. And so currently they're having to like log out of GitLab and log back in, to another, GitLab account to be able to see stuff associated with the company that they're trying to, consult with or for.
It seems like a pretty big change for that small of a use case. Just thinking about it out loud.
I mean, I don't think that's the only reason that the change is being made, but I think that is actually almost like an unintended benefit of the change, because I don't think that was like why the change was being introduced. But I think that's something that we're finding that is actually going to be, yeah, better, maybe better for some people.
Cool. I think I have the next question. So obviously this is a hard problem to solve. I'm speaking a little bit from personal experience in a prior company where we had several different self-managed instances set up specifically because we have like an isolated environment for, say, data that you need security clearance for. And I'm just trying to imagine the workflow switching between a project on instance A versus instance B. Does this organization style concept help those users, or is it just add like another hurdle for them to get to the different projects on different instances?
I mean, I think that this should help, and I think that's kind of what Will was talking about a little bit too. It's been really interesting talking to people this milestone, because yeah, a lot of people are like, when I'm showing them the say the to-do counts and things like that, and I'm saying like, okay, those are going to be different based on the organization you're in. How is that going to impact your experience? And they're saying, well, that's good. I don't want them to be like, I want, if I'm in this instance or organization or whatever, I want to know, I want the information to be separate for proprietary reasons or whatever. And also just so you can keep your kind of workflows separate and you know exactly what you're working on. And yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not trying to say that like there's nobody who's going to be negatively impacted by this or something like that. I'm definitely not saying that, but I think I was surprised to learn that I think it will actually be helpful for people who are working in that way. And exactly as you're saying, people who are working in multiple instances, or hopefully making it so that they don't have to have different browser profiles or log in as separate user accounts. They can just have the one user account and then just navigate between the different organizations that they're a member of.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. This isn't a perfect analogy, but it is helpful to me that my work Slack is different from my church Slack, from my friends Slack. So that isolation does kind of help keep things where they belong without having to intermix them.
Yeah, and I think Slack's a good example because I think a lot of people are used to using different kind of organizations, or I don't even know if that's the right terminology in Slack, but yeah, that there's the separation of the different accounts in Slack too. So yeah.
Funny enough, I think they're called workspace. But really well explained, Amelia. Thank you so much. I thought that you did a great job explaining such a complex topic.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I've been trying to wrap my head around all this for the last few months, so I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Thank you. Any other questions from anyone?